Okay, let me go live for the YouTube now. So we are now live on YouTube, I think. And yeah, it's live right now. Okay, so let's get started. Thank you everybody for joining. Today, this is the second of the consciousness talks in 2022. And today's topic is phenomenology and quantum cognition. Some of you may find this, topic title to be very enigmatic, but you'll see how these two apparently separate things are coming together with our exciting speaker, Shigeru Taguchi, a professor in Hokkaido University, followed by Professor Peter Bruza from Queensland University of Technology. And we decided that Shigeru is going first, followed by a couple of questions and also discussion, and then followed by Peter's presentation and discussion. So, Shigeru, could you share your slide?
Okay. So, is it okay?
Yes. Yes, and the title of the talk is Mediation and Contextuality, Rethinking the Concept of Consciousness. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you now. So thank you very much for inviting me to this interesting event. So today I'd like to talk about mediation and contextuality, but I use this term contextuality in a general sense, so not as a technical term in quantum physics. So, and I'd like to rethink the concept of consciousness and propose a little bit different alternative concept of or image of consciousness, which is twisted loop. So let me start. This is the outline of my talk and introduction. So today I'm going to talk about what might be a better concept of consciousness. So as you know, the field of consciousness studies is still quite chaotic, and we don't have even a unified concept of consciousness. So I believe that it is meaningful to search for a better concept of consciousness through trial and error. And first, I will contrast the container model and the mediation model of consciousness. So what I mean by mediation model suggests that consciousness is not a kind of thing, a thing-like being, but a specific structure of mutual mediation or intermediation between the body and the world. So then I will try to describe this structure as a twisted loop between the body and the world. So finally, I will argue that this concept allows us to more easily understand the relation between different consciousnesses, so multiple consciousnesses. So intersubjectivity can be better understood by this concept I would discuss. I would argue. So, in the first section, container model. So we often use expressions such as I have something in mind, or something is present in my consciousness, etc. So these expressions strongly suggest that consciousness is a kind of container that holds various contents inside it. So, however, this is merely one way of putting the situation. So it is just a way to communicate with others about the mind and the consciousness. So this is different from what we actually experience. So consciousness is not experienced as a container. So this is the point that Edmund Husserl, the founder of phenomenology, also emphasized. So if consciousness is experienced as a container, so it must be possible to look at it from the outside. Otherwise, we cannot know that it is a container. So, however, it is impossible for us to look at consciousness from the outside. So if we are conscious of the container, our consciousness is already beyond the container, and this contradicts the concept of consciousness as a container. So of course, we can know and talk about what we are not conscious of. So for example, subpersonal processes, they are usually not experienced consciously. So however, they are scientifically revealed to us through highly deliberate conscious consideration. So we are talking about such subpersonal processes only when we are conscious of them. So in this way, they are also objects of consciousness. So from the perspective of my consciousness, the whole universe is the correlate of my consciousness. So for me, the universe is not something outside of my consciousness. So I cannot look at the boundaries of my consciousness. So the universe is neither contained in consciousness nor outside of consciousness. It is highly important to exclude simplistic spatial images of consciousness. So, okay, and now let me ask you the following question. So where do you find your consciousness? So you will notice that you cannot answer this question, at least easily. This question of where does not fit the concept of consciousness. I cannot find my consciousness at a particular place in the universe. So rather, it relates to the whole universe. So there cannot be a containment relationship between consciousness and the universe. So we often use expressions such as the universe is in consciousness or consciousness is in the universe. But I claim that these expressions are not appropriate, but rather misleading. So Francisco Varela very aptly grasps this point and expresses it as follows. If the mind is not in the head, where the hell is it? It is precisely the point here. It is in this non-place of the co-determination of inner and outer. So one cannot say that one cannot say that is outside or inside. Next section, mediation model. So far, I have argued that the container model is misleading. So what then is a more appropriate concept of consciousness? So I would claim that a mediation model would be a little bit better. So consciousness is not a thing-like being, but rather a kind of relational event. What kind of relational event is it? So first, I'd like to mention intentionality concept in phenomenology. So in phenomenology, it is said that consciousness is essentially intentional. So we are always conscious of something. Consciousness is always about something. It is directed and related to something. So according to my interpretation, this is almost the same as saying that consciousness has some content. For example, when we are conscious of the red color, our consciousness is related to red things or the redness of red. So if you remove the red things or the redness of red from the consciousness of red, it becomes something completely different or is essentially destroyed. So this means that the consciousness of red is intrinsically dependent on red things and the redness of red. So I interpret intentionality to mean intrinsic dependence on some object or content. And then objects of consciousness are not given in isolation, and they always appear in relation to other objects and against a background. Yeah, they always appear against a background. And these relations are called horizons in phenomenology. So this means that a particular object can only be experienced in relation to all other objects and the situations in which it is placed. Therefore, the most comprehensive objective correlate of consciousness is the world or the universe. So thus, consciousness depends on the world as its essential correlate. In other words, the existence of consciousness is mediated by the world or the universe. On the other hand, consciousness is also dependent on or mediated by our body. So why? The world as a correlate of consciousness is universal, and it is common to all consciousnesses. Then what makes consciousness different from other consciousnesses? The principle of such individuation would be our bodies. I said that consciousness cannot be found in a specific place, but it clearly depends on individual locality. What you can be conscious of in Sapporo, here in Hokkaido, is different from what you can be conscious of in Melbourne or New York. So this is due to the location of the body on which your consciousness depends. So mediated by our bodies, consciousness relates to locality. Thus, in this way, consciousness is mediated by the world on the one hand, and because it would not exist without the world. On the other hand, consciousness is mediated by the body, because without the body, it does not exist. So consciousness is characterized by this double mediation. Or rather, consciousness is nothing other than this mutual mediation between the body and the world. So next I will argue this point a little bit more in detail. So, third section, twisted loop. So first I will argue that the body and the world form a context for each other. First, on the one hand, the body is not isolated from the world as its context. Our bodily being is always our bodily being is always embedded in the experienced world. Our bodies are the results of complex processes within the universe. And second, on the other hand, when the world appears, its particular appearance corresponds to a particular body that experiences the world as such. So when the world appears as splendid on a sunny day, this appearance is dependent on my body, which experiences the world as splendid. Without my body, the world as perceived in this specific way would not exist. If this way of perceiving and experiencing the world did not exist, the world would not be at least exactly the same as the current world. In this sense, the existence of the body I am experiencing makes an essential contribution to the being such and such of the present world. So this means that each individual body provides a particular context for the way the world appears. So thus, in this way, the body and the world provide the context for each other. The body is a part of the world, but the world depends on this particular part of itself to appear as it actually does. So in a sense, the body and the world include each other, but the way one includes the other is of a different kind. So they include the other in different ways through different routes. So what we have here is a kind of twisted loop, like a Möbius strip. I would claim that consciousness is nothing other than such a twisted loop structure that would not be possible without either the body or the world. So Douglas Hofstadter said something similar. So he talked about a strange loop in his book, I Am a Strange Loop. But I think it is not a term referring to consciousness, but to self, the concept of self. And also, his emphasis is on recursive structures, but my emphasis is on a structure of mutual nesting, mutual containment, or something like that. Okay. So his strange loop is a little bit different from my proposal, twisted loop, but maybe similar point is also contained. Okay. This loop is not an abstract loop structure. It's not just abstract, but has a localized anchoring point, that is the body. The locality of the body serves as a medium through which the loop structure is concretized and actualized. So this is how the loop structure acquires the characteristic of individuality. Consciousness as a twisted loop structure can have individuality, which is referred to by expressions such as my consciousness or your consciousness and so on. So the fourth section, interbeing. So next I'd like to ask the question, how does consciousness relate to other consciousnesses? So the individuality of consciousness should not be understood by the container model, as I discussed. And consciousness is not a box or a container. So my consciousness is not a closed box that excludes communication with others outside of it. Consciousness is a contextual phenomenon involving two correlates, the body and the world. Among them, the world is a common ground shared by multiple bodies. By involving this common ground as an intrinsic correlate, my consciousness and the other's consciousnesses are necessarily intertwined with each other. In other words, they are contextual to each other. So if a change in my body changes the world, that change cannot help but affect other bodies, because this change is a common phenomenon in the world. So the kind of mutual mediation between different consciousnesses can be called interbeing, according to Francisco Varela. So he speaks of the enactive co-determination of me-other. I think this is a very interesting expression. And he also, he is correct when he says individuality and intersubjectivity are not in opposition, but necessarily complementary. The individuality of my consciousness depends on its intersubjective relationship to other consciousnesses and vice versa. So the intersubjectivity also depends on individuality of each consciousness. So my consciousness is distinct from others and dependent on others at the same time. Distinct and dependent at the same time. So we can understand this situation better if we employ the concept of consciousness as a twisted loop. So consciousness are intertwined because they involve the world as their shared correlate. At the same time, each of them has another pole, the body. So each consciousness has a different, unique body as its anchoring point. So this component, body, makes each consciousness individual. By being stretched between two poles, body and the world, the consciousness can be both individual and intersubjective. In such a way, the individuality and intersubjectivity of consciousness can be easily understood through the concept of twisted loop. Okay, let me conclude. As I have discussed so far, we can use the concept of a twisted loop to better understand consciousness, and especially to liberate it from the container model that we often presuppose as consciousness. And finally, I would like to stress that consciousness is not a thing-like being, but a relational event characterized by the the mutual mediation, the double mediation between the body and the world. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, so before we take this question from the audience, both in here and also in YouTube, if you have any comments or questions, you can put it on chat or directly raise the hand or speak. And also, I forgot to mention that we plan to take a break, roughly like 5 minutes or so before going to Peter's talk. So when the question exhausts, then we will have a 5 minute break or so. So is there any question from the audience first? Yes, Kianshen.
Yes, thank you very much for your talk. I find it very interesting. But can you give an example on how consciousnesses is intertwined between different agents? I'm not sure if I summarized that appropriately.
Yeah. An example. Okay. So, for example, if I see someone in front of me, then my body and that person's body are necessarily resonate with resonate each other. So we cannot help but reacting to others, the change of the other's body in such a way. Different bodies are always resonating each other. That's one example. Or I think the mirror neuron would be also an example. If we see someone is doing something, then the mirror neuron system function as a mirror of that action, and in such a way, in this case, also bodies resonate each other. This is maybe another example. So I think there are a lot of examples for that. Does it make sense?
Yes. So my understanding, I also have like an understanding. I'll explain in an example. For example, you see a building, and that building is designed by someone else. So it's like someone else's projection of what aesthetically pleasing building should look like is in that building, and then it's perceived by you. So in a sense, your understanding of what a building should be like and this other designer's understanding of what a building is like kind of intertwined. Is that kind of also a similar example?
Okay, building. So a building is a common object of both of me and you, and my perception of the building is different from your perception. In this way, consciousnesses are different and individual, but they are both consciousnesses or perceptions of the same identical building. In such a way, they must be intertwined with each other, So Edward Husserl, phenomenologist, explained that this situation in such a way, so that the object, in this case the building, is something identical in this interconnection between consciousnesses, and this identical moment is something ideal. It's not real, but ideal. And we can never attain the complete final perception of that building. Our perceptions are always ongoing and on the way, and or underway. So the object itself cannot be attained, cannot be grasped in final perception or something like that. So in such a way, Husserl uses the contrast between the ideal moment, ideal component of the relation, and actual components of the relation. And these actual components are especially intertwined with each other, but it always circles around the ideal component of that relationship.
Oh, okay.
Maybe
Okay, maybe
does it help a little bit?
yeah, maybe let's come back afterwards after the sort of the Peter's talk. But let me take two questions from Iota and then Peter, and then anybody else. If you have any comments or questions further, please type it in the chat. Okay, Iota first. You're muted, I think.
Yes, thanks for your interesting talk, and your model sounds reasonable, but my question is that if you take your model, how will it change the way how we investigate consciousness in a scientific way? That is my question.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I'm not a scientist, so I cannot answer this question in detail. But I think maybe we can change the design of experiment using the concept of consciousness I propose. Usually we conduct experiments on experiments about consciousness in a closed room, and a person is isolated from the environment, and he or she is confronted with a screen, and that's a very artificial situation. And in this situation, it must be very difficult to investigate, for example, interpersonal, intersubjective relationship between multiple subjects. And so maybe we can approach consciousness through more interactive way of interactive kind of experiment. And maybe such an attempt have been already made. So something like interbrain. What is that? Interbrain measurement or something like that. So yeah, I can say just something like that. So very general thing, but yeah, I am a philosopher, so I can just provide such general idea, and I expect that scientists use this idea in some way, in one way or another. So yeah, but yeah.
Okay.
I hope I answered a little bit your question.
Yeah, it's our job to come up with something.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
All right, Peter.
No, thanks, Shigeru, for your very thought-provoking talk. The one thing I wanted to bring up is what your view is from, I guess, the Eastern philosophical perspective, and the way I'll bring this question up is via Erwin Schrödinger, who maybe not everyone knows, is one of the founding fathers of quantum physics. In the 1940s, he wrote this very intriguing article. I think it was called The Arithmetic Paradox, The Oneness of Mind. And there he said that there is only, say, one mind, one consciousness, but that there is individual consciousness. It's just it's really just nothing significant. There is only this one mind, right? So in Buddhism, they have this metaphor of, it's called Indra's net, where it's a big network of diamonds, and each diamond can be seen as sort of like an individual consciousness, but each diamond reflects all other diamonds. So in a sense, maybe in your terminology, each diamond mutually includes all diamonds everywhere. So do you see any sympathy between your particular view and also the view I express more from Eastern philosophy, that there is only one consciousness, and that their individual consciousness is something not is really significant, maybe on a surface thing?
Yeah, thank you for your question. Yeah, that's really interesting. So of course, I'm really sympathetic to such Eastern ideas, Eastern thoughts. And Indra's net, yeah, that is really interesting. And Huayan school of Buddhism is really interesting philosophy, and I think that is also a little bit similar to Leibniz monadology, in which each monad mirrors all monads and the whole universe.
Yeah.
So yeah, this kind of how should I say, mutual mirroring, mutual containment. That's yeah. I also think that this is very interesting. But on the other hand, we must be very careful when we use this kind of idea, because when we talk about Indra's net or monadology, we often look at the whole universe at the same time from yeah, as if we looked at it from a bird's eye view.
Mm.
But we never attain such a bird's eye view, and we are always in the Indra's net. We are always one particular diamond in the Indra's net.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this point of view is also very fundamental. Yeah, the viewpoint that is that depends on the nowness and here locality.
Yeah.
Yeah. So and that's why yeah, I don't usually say that consciousness is only one, because if we say that, we very easily lose the perspective of locality, so such an individual perspective.
Okay.
Yeah. But of course, I understand when someone says that consciousness is only one. It is also true, I believe. It is also true, and individual consciousnesses are not absolute. They are not ultimate. Rather, they are just one aspect of the consciousness per se. Yeah. So I basically agree with you, but maybe I would like to stress the individual perspective.
So now can I ask another question, a short one?
Okay.
If it's short,
do we have to go?
If it's short,
so
yeah, sure.
Sure. So the first, well, I actually got two.
Maybe then, shall we actually keep it later?
No, okay, maybe I'll just do the short one, and the other one I can do later. Like, so you mentioned Varela, right? Yeah. Do you ever, like, in his writings, he was very, very sympathetic to Buddhist philosophy, but in his writings he doesn't express this one mind idea that is. So do you know why he never went to that extent?
Yeah, I don't know exactly why he didn't use that expression, but I guess Varela also wanted to stress the individual point of view and local actualization of the consciousness.
Yeah.
So maybe he did not want to jump to the one mind, jump to the absolute consciousness as a whole, or something like that. I don't know. I guess. I just guess.
Okay, so we have one question in chat, but we'll take that at the beginning of the sort of the entire discussion session after Peter's talk, if that's okay. So we'll take a 5-minute break starting from now.
Okay.
And then we'll start from Peter's talk. Emmanuel. All right.
Good morning.
Yep. Hello. Right. So I guess now it's good time to start. Please, Peter.
Okay.
That's 5 minutes on my end. All right. So the second talk is going to be by Professor Peter Bruza, and he's gonna talk about quantum-like contextuality in cognition and what it might mean for the philosophy of mind. It's not shared entirely. Peter, do you wanna press the button for complete screen sharing? I mean, make it bigger.
So you can't see it? I'm sharing it.
No, we can see it, but on the left side, we still see the presenter note kind of thing, or overview.
Need to press start slideshow.
Yeah, slideshow thing.
Okay, start. Is that better?
Yeah, yes.
Yes.
All right, great.
Okay, so this talk really is something that it's not an argument for anything. I think it's really like a collection of thoughts that I've been having, and principally around contextuality, and also some, what those thoughts might say about the philosophy of mind. So in a way, I don't want the title of the talk to come across as something very arrogant. So I've been thinking about contextuality for quite a while in my investigation into quantum cognition. And ultimately, when you start to look into contextuality, inevitably you must consider the nature of the underlying phenomena, and also be clear about what assumptions you have about that phenomena. So that's really where I think the connection to the philosophy of mind might come in. Is that so? I would like to highlight at least some possibilities to think about what if say, for example, a cognitive phenomenon is quantum-like contextual. There may be some things we might be able to say or about the ultimate nature of those quantum phenomena. Okay, so okay. So I'll just start off by saying that contextuality in quantum physics is really something that has been studied a lot and continues to be studied in quantum foundations and also in quantum information. I remember reading an article a couple of years ago from Nature, in the Nature journal, and someone was saying, one of the people working in quantum information saying really that contextuality is something that is really the resource that drives quantum computation. But it is a subtle motion. And this is something that, in my own explorations in this area, I've been looking at it for many years now, and then it's something like you build up an understanding of what it is, and then it's almost like it's continually slipping through my fingers. And so it's almost like my journey with it is almost like this gradual sort of process of trying to come up with an understanding of what this is. And I hope with this presentation I can sort of bring across some of that. But nevertheless, even though that it's talked about a lot in the literature, it has been for decades, there are some rigorous theoretical empirical methods that have been developed within the quantum physics community to study it. And some of those have been adapted or brought across into the quantum cognition community. And the third point is that there has been some speculation for some time that quantum-like contextuality may be present in human cognition. So I want to start with the next bit is to just set some concepts down so you understand where it is that I'm coming from. So the first is non-contextual realism. And there are two aspects of this. Properties have well-established values prior to measurement. So what I'm going to use here with this picture is the analogy that you might have some urn. And the urn I'm thinking of is I read George Gould's 1862 article about probability theory. And there he talked about an urn, and he talked about balls being pulled from the urn. And the balls have colours, you know, they've got a shape, and they're made from, say, glass or ivory. So, but when you think about, and this is the sort of thing that we talk, you know, when we learn about probability theory or we teach it, these urns are often used. And so when you think about it, like the balls or the objects are in the urn, and then they have pre-established properties. So it's white before you even look at it. And it has a well-established property. So its whiteness is well-established, it's determined. So this is determinism. And the second aspect is the measurement of a property is independent of the measurement of other properties that are taken along with it. And this is non-contextuality. So when I establish the whiteness of the ball, that's not going to change when I sort of establish that it's round. And this particular non-contextual realism, these aspects, they find their way into non-contextual probability assignments. Because this, as I said, I mentioned George Gould's article about probability theory. So what that means is that when you're sampling from the urn, so you're pulling out different objects. You're looking at it and you've got a white one, and you've got a red one, you've got a blue one, you've got another white one. There is a certain probability that it's going to be white, okay? But just imagine that in one particular situation, you're not only establishing its color, but you're also establishing the shape of the object. So you've got the situation with the probability it's white and round, and also you've got the dual of that, the probability that it's white and not round. But then you do this again, you sample from the urn, and then you're sampling, okay, what substance is it made of? And so you sort of like establishing the color, whether it's white, and along with it, you say whether it's ivory or it might not be made out of ivory. So the non-contextual probability assignments is reflected in that equation below, that these joint probabilities across the whiteness and its shape and the whiteness and substance doesn't change. Now so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to try and bring across some essential points of contextuality. And I'm going to do this in a way that, beforehand I should say that I've simplified it. So the picture is often more technical than what I'm going to bring across, but I'd like to just bring across a couple of the essential elements. So just imagine that we have this experiment where we're looking at sort of like human subjects. And what we're trying to establish is the color of their eyes, and say we're going to measure the size of their feet. So in that one experimental condition, we make those two joint measurements. And in another condition, we establish the eye color of the subject and also their size. And you can notice in this is kind of a strange experiment that you wouldn't see in real life, is that in the second condition, the eye now is brown. So imagine that you're doing that for the same subject in both conditions. So contextuality is the following. So that the eye color changes depending on what property is being jointly measured with. So this then is sort of the counter of the non-contextuality that I was talking about in the previous slide. And the other important point is the change cannot be reduced to a causal explanation. And then there's a third point that I won't go, it's a technical point, is that there's a notion of incompatibility in the background here that is important in defining it. But so maybe just to sort of calibrate our intuitions around this, is so that we're getting sort of like this change. So that depending on the value we get for a certain property really depends on what we're co-measuring it with within given experimental conditions. Now, so with that as the background, there is this sort of inconsistency that is being sort of put forward within quantum physics. And that inconsistency is reflected in that top line. So what we have is quantum theory. So this, you can imagine this is the axioms of quantum theory. We've got determinism. So at each point in time, a property has some sort of definite, well-established value. Like think about the objects that are coming out of the urn. It's got a definite color at all times. It's got a definite shape at all times. And also in this non-contextuality. So if I'm doing joint measurements, so if I'm establishing a color, the color is not going to be affected by other measurements that I make jointly on the object or the ball that comes out of the urn. And the final one is faithful measurement. So this is really can be boiled down to the values of properties can be faithfully read off by some measurement process. I'm not going to say too much about a faithful measurement from this point on, but this last point is sort of in the literature reflected in different ways, but I've rendered it this way because I think it's more intuitive. So the question you have is like, how do you deal with this inconsistency? All right, so the quantum theory and determinism, non-contextuality, and faithful measurement is inconsistent. So it really depends on what school of thought you come from. And one prominent school is the contextual hidden variables approach. And so what they do is they give up non-contextuality. So they would argue that quantum theory with determinism and contextuality and faithful measurement leads to something that's consistent. So let's just look at what that might look like if we take a contextual hidden variables view of the world. So we go back to our experiment. We've got the eye beforehand. Before measurement, it's blue. Okay, so then we move it into one measurement context 1. And so we measure with it the size of the foot, and then the color of the eye is still blue. And then we move into a second measurement context, where in this case, instead of measuring the size of the feet, we measure the size of the person, and suddenly the color of the eye changes to brown. But you see here, so even though that it's obvious that what's being observed changes depending on what you're measuring with, but at every single point in time, the property, the eye color, has a definite value. So let's just move to the quantum cognition situation. So one of the basic premises of quantum cognition is that cognitive phenomena are somehow like quantum phenomena. Okay, so if we now argue by way of analogy, we will have this sort of inconsistency. So we've got quantum cognition, which is the theory of quantum cognition, which is sort of borrows much from the formalism of quantum theory. And now determinism, in this case, means each point in time a cognitive property has a definite value, so that's determinism. We have, we assume non-contextuality and faithful measurement, the values of cognitive properties can be faithfully read off. So if we have some human subject and we're asking to come up with some decision or to rate something, when we ask them, we assume that the result we get is really we're just reading off what they were thinking just before they were asked. So that would be the corresponding intuition of faithful measurement in the cognitive experiment. So now we have this dilemma, and this has been one of my primary dilemmas to deal with. So how do we deal with this inconsistency within the field of quantum cognition? And by dealing with this inconsistency in the way that I propose, I think it opens up some interesting possibilities, speculative possibilities to think about what it might mean for the philosophy of mind. So in the quantum cognition case, what do we give up? So we have quantum cognition. The next one that I is we don't have determinism anymore. We've got indeterminacy, and we also got contextuality. And I've grayed out faithful measurement because realistically and within cognitive psychology, I think that the assuming faithful measurement is something that it certainly can be contested and debatable. So how does this differ from the previous case where we had, before measurement, the eye color had a pre-established value of being blue. So now we have, before measurement, we have this strange thing here, this figure is meant to represent something that's indeterminate. So it's ontologically uncertain. So we can't say anything about the state it's in. It's not in a definite state. But this doesn't have to do anything to do with the information we have. Even if we had all the information available, we would not know what state it is in before measurement. And so when the measurement happens of the thing, so in the first case, suddenly this indeterminate phenomena suddenly actualizes itself as blue. And that's the blue color of the eye when we measure it with the size of the feet. In the second measurement context, this indeterminate phenomena actualizes as the color brown when we co-measure with the size of the person. So this is very, very different to the previous case when we were assuming determinism. And so what's going on here? And what I'd like to share with you some aspects that I really appreciate from Itamar Plotnitsky, who wrote about Boole's probability theory. And George Boole proposed in his article a set of mathematical inequalities, which he called the conditions of possible experience. And then if you assume non-contextual realism, then all the probabilities adhere to these inequalities. And what physicists have found is that quantum phenomena violate these inequalities in a way. To go back to Boole's intuition, they're reflecting something that is outside of what we would normally consider an experience. And then one formal manifestation of what's happening is that it's impossible to construct the joint probability distribution. So imagine you do the experiment of measuring the color with the shape, and in another measurement context or another experiment, you sample, you take the color and the substance of which the object is made. And the question then is, can you then construct a single joint distribution reflecting what's going on? And then what physicists found, it's not possible. And then what Plotnitsky did, and I really appreciate, he had some intuitions about what's going on. And when he was reflecting on this no distribution, he says the no distribution approach takes a view that certain phenomena, or more precisely, certain aspects of certain phenomena, have no causal explanation. They simply occur, and that is it. So there is no deeper reality which causes them to occur. The phenomena themselves are their deepest explanation. So, you know, I don't want to put my words into Plotnitsky's mouth, but what I take from this is he's saying there is a reality there, but you can't really say much about it, if anything. So taking Plotnitsky's intuitions there, I want to connect that to a philosophy I recently discovered by Arkady Plotnitsky. And he has put forward this philosophy, reality-without-realism. And so I'd like to introduce that next. So this is just a very, very succinct and concise statement of what this reality with realism is. So Plotnitsky says reality is assumed to exist, so it's there. But without making any assumptions concerning the character of this existence, which allows one to place this character beyond representation. So this is the weak reality with realism, or even conception. This is the strong notion of reality. So we can't even conceive of what that reality is. And when I was reflecting on that, and to go back to this discussion around Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism, and particularly Zen Buddhism, which I'm familiar with, this sort of sentiment has been around a long, long time, for millennia, in fact. So I've got a couple of quotes from ancient Zen masters. The first one is Shi Tao, which was a Zen master in the Chinese period. And when their teachings are translated in English, one of the things that they talk about is this notion of suchness. And suchness can be thought of as this present reality that we're currently experiencing, but there's something mystical about it. There's something that we can't get to the bottom of. We can't grasp it, what it is. So Shi Tao says suchness is ungraspable, and it cannot be grasped beyond suchness. As such or non-such, it cannot be grasped at all. So to me, this is very, very similar to this strong conception of reality without realism. So the suchness is there, but we can't grasp anything about it at all, certainly conceptually. Zen Master Dogen, for the Japanese that are listening now, Zen Master Dogen was a very, very famous Japanese Zen master who had some wonderful teachings in philosophy. And he also reflected on this. Suchness is realization of ungraspability as such. Again, we're reflecting that it cannot be conceived. It cannot be captured by the intellect. But then we've got some more modern versions, but I wouldn't suggest that the following two people are Zen masters. But this reality without realism that Plotnitsky puts forward was inspired a lot by Niels Bohr. And he has a number of statements that around that towards the end, particularly towards the end, that this quantum reality, we can't even conceive of what it is. And so he says, in quantum mechanics, we're not dealing with an arbitrary renunciation of a more detailed analysis of an atomic phenomena, with the recognition that such an analysis is in principle excluded. So this in principle is Bohr emphasized himself. So this is alluding to that we cannot really conceive of what this reality is. And I feel that Peirce was reflecting the same thing. His intuition is, okay, we have these phenomena that don't adhere to this, we can't construct this distribution. He says they simply occur, and that is it. We can't say anything more. So just to summarize some aspects of reality without realism, so there is no causality. So there are no pre-existing properties existing independent of observation, because if there were, we would be able to say something about that reality. So there is this inherent indeterminacy, or you can say this ontological uncertainty. There's a very, very, very profound uncertainty that has to do with the very, very beingness of the phenomena. And then Plotnitsky says the contextuality is automatic when we talk about reality without realism, and that's given incompatibility. So I want to now sort of take the talk to the next bit where I promised to say something about enactive cognition. So this sentiment or this intuition from Peirce, they simply occur, and that is these phenomena. I want to sort of speculatively and sort of put this intuition out there that we can have these phenomenal properties now they're very now, they occur, they happen now, but they are beyond representation or conception. And so some cognitive experiments that we've been doing is, so when you see, say, a face like this, one of the judgments that human beings do is to judge whether a face is trustworthy. So one of the things that we've been looking at is this judgment of trustworthy, is it like this phenomenal property? It's not something that is established in advance. So sort of now, taken by what I've said, what might it mean for the philosophy of mind, all the points that I've brought up so far, this sort of rather disconnected list of thoughts that I've put forward. And I think it boils down to, what is it that we can say or point to? Maybe we can't say anything about the ultimate nature of these cognitive phenomena. And this is where I draw on a picture that I got from Peirce. There's almost like this possibility to talk about a bifurcated realism. So that on the one hand, we have the aspects of this phenomena adhere to this reality without realism. So properties like spin of particles, and also we're putting forward like judgments of trust in the cognitive sense are like this. But also there are properties of the phenomena that we can sort of at least argue that they have a conventional realism associated with them. So Plotnitsky in his argument, when you talk about the baryon number of say, a quantum particle, you can say that this is a property it has that's sort of independent of measurement. Or we've been discussing in our group here, when you think about cognitive biases, you can think about them as perhaps being cognitive properties that are established in advance of, say, an interaction or some sort of measurement. So finally, I want to sort of place two views in front of you to close the talk. One is the view of the computational mind. So this is the view that cognition is something that computes. So that the cognition represents some sort of external reality, and it computes these representations. This view holds that cognitive states are determinate, so that they always have a well-established value. It's Cartesian, so the mind is assumed to operate within the bounds of the brain. Here is where causality has a home, and we know that causality underpins context sensitivity. So in another way to say, the context sensitivity, which we know is an effect in cognition, is parasitic on causality. We can talk about a realism, but this is what we call a cognitive realism, that we assume that the cognitive phenomena have these determinate states of well-established values, and this is studied analytically. But I'd like to put forward another view that I really am very predisposed to, is this phenomenological mind. So we're not talking about representing things, but it's about experiencing non-representational cognitive properties. And for example, phenomenal beliefs or phenomenal properties. They're indeterminate cognitive states. And what I mean by that, they're ontologically indeterminate. So that the very being of that cognitive state is uncertain, is indeterminate. It's not that we don't know what it is, its very nature is indeterminate. So this is when we talk about embodiment and enactive cognition, that we have non-causality, and associated that with is contextuality. And I hope my talk has made that connection fairly clear. We're talking about reality without realism, which embraces non-causality and contextuality, and it's studied phenomenologically. So that's my talk, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Peter. Okay, so we'll take another list of questions and comments, but maybe let me start with both Shigeru and also Peter, probably, because I think both of you two actually sounded like in the end some kind of introspection within ourselves or communication with other people. Before we do that kind of inquiry or probing, you don't know what the property is. That's a sort of the general kind of gist that I had. Even for your own phenomenology or your consciousness, attending to yourself, or trying to report or trying to focus on something to conceptualize, that's the time when you measure your phenomenology. And also in your case of Shigeru, probably until you ask somebody whether you are conscious or not or something like that, there is a comment in the chat, but unless you ask about that to this locked-in syndrome person, you don't know whether he is alive or conscious or something like that. Before you ask, there is no answer. Is that fair summary or a common point for both of your view?
I'd only add one thing now. You said we don't know, but before we measure, the point I'm trying to make, when you're talking about this ontological uncertainty, you can't know. You cannot know what it is. Because I think this is the difference between epistemic uncertainty, so that we have a lot of things where we assume that the system is in a definite state, some determinate state, but we don't know what state it's in. So this is an epistemic uncertainty, so we don't know. What I'm talking about in terms of this indeterminacy is that, and this reality without realism, that we cannot know what it is before. The only thing that we can see is in measurement, something happens. That's it. That's essentially the basis of Plotnitsky's comment.
Okay. Shigeru, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I agree your summary, but maybe if I may answer to that question about locked-in syndrome, maybe consciousness in locked-in syndrome patients is also determined, is also mediated by the history of his or her consciousness. So in the past, the patient had an experience of the outer world and the other people, and she had interaction with the world and the other people, and such a history makes it possible for her to have consciousness. So in this way, locked-in syndrome patients also have an interaction with the world indirectly. Maybe not now, but in the past, she had such interaction. So that is one answer to that. And what now said is also correct, I think. So if we don't ask if this patient has consciousness or not, before that we don't have answer, or the answer is not determinate.
Assuming that the reality is sort of dependent on the perspective, which may or may not be kind of consistent, and also has a definitive and objectively kind of shared kind of status, I think.
Yeah.
Emmanuel, do you have any comments or questions? Yeah, thanks for joining.
I mean, I enjoy obviously Peter's talk, right? I mean, this is all the stuff we've been, discussing and talking about for several years. As far as, I mean, as a psychologist, as far as the only thing that's worth perhaps mentioning for not for Peter now, but perhaps for the other colleagues, is that so in psychology, social psychologists are very happy with the idea that decisions or questions sometimes construct rather than reveal, which is basically the quantum-like position that there's no predetermined answer. Say if I'm asked whether I like my breakfast or this painting, essentially I do something that is a little bit like collapsing a superposition, and that changed my mental state. So the psychology area under which all this comes under is essentially constructive influences in judgment. That is, when you make a judgment, you construct. However, I think a problem that we have is that it's unlikely that all judgments are like this. So, from a psychophysicist, like now, perhaps, if you see like a very simple stimulus, like a square in front of you, well, that's a square, right? Regardless of what else is there. And I think the difficulty is just trying to predict in advance whether something is going to be more quantum-like, and a mental state in response to a stimulus is going to be more like a superposition as opposed to more like an eigenstate. And that's actually a difficult problem. That is, how to predict in advance. But also, as I was taking a step back, the kind of even trickier problem is why. So, I mean, for cognitive psychologists especially, everything, cognitive psychologists love their adaptive explanations, right? They always ask, all right, so if the mind does something, then why does it do that? And the real difficulty, I think, lies in trying to ask the question, okay, let's say, Well, obviously, myself, I completely agree with what Peter says, right? But let's say in general, all right, let's take Peter's view as it is. Why would the mind be structured like this? Why would the mind create representations that have these properties? And that is a really tricky question. That is, the origin of quantum-like structure in cognition is something that's not really been addressed.
Right.
And something that I think has been kind of like underexplored a little bit.
Yeah.
So yeah, but I mean, I suppose so. Just to sum up, I would say there are two things. The first is that I mean, it seems likely there is a separation between situations where the representation is quantum-like and the uncertainty is ontological, and situations where the representation is more like an eigenstate or epistemic. And predicting this a priori would give us a lot more power in whatever claims we're making. And the second issue, I suppose, is the origins issue. If we assume that there are quantum-like representations in some cases, then I suppose we need a narrative as to why this makes sense for the mind.
Yeah. Right. Peter, do you want to add a comment, or can I ask some question, or can I make some comments about that then?
You're the boss, so you can make all the comments.
I think that also, this also relates to both of your presentation, as well as also, Emmanuel's comment right now. So I feel like it's fair things to say right now. William James, it seems like he has said many interesting things in the past, but one of the things he said was that all the psychological textbook right now start, I mean, at that time, even like in the beginning of the 20th century, starts with as if the consciousness or percept or psychology starts with the simplest percept or sensation, and then to build up to, like, what Emmanuel said, like a more and more complex kind of things. And that's the sort of the premise from starting from probably Wundt's tradition, right? But this simplest sensation kind of thing is an extremely idealized and also not really present kind of state of the mind or consciousness, and that also forces us to really going discarding the actual complex, contextual rich phenomenology, and focus on only one aspect of that, and then building on that special kind of logical classical probability like world, you can probably make some kind of inference and the probability theory, and all these things can be built up. But the reality is that it's a really homogeneously complex kind of thing in the real world. Like many of the interactions, many of the phenomena appears only once in your lifetime. And so you can't really compute the probability of the joint probability really precisely through repeated measurement and so on. So the evolutionary origin or psychological origin of this, not assuming that everything is deterministically going from this to that, may be built in the brain to be adaptive in the first place. And that's something that I was thinking. And that relates to maybe William James' eventual sort of the idea of the pure experience, where he also thinks that, like Shigeru probably, subject and object kind of, distinction is not really clear, and so on. But that has been very difficult to deal with in the reductionistic neuroscience and the psychological, psychophysical study up until relatively recently. And so the more complex naturalistic experiment, until this comes around, we couldn't really deal with it. That's how I view it. What do you think?
Yeah, I can try.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I feel that Shigeru mentioned Varroa and this whole enactive paradigm, and it's something I think philosophically, theoretically, it's very, very interesting, right? But if you go to the cognitive psychology conference or the cognitive science conference, there are very few people that do this sort of research. So part of the issue is that the way behaviorism is sort of played out within cognitive psychology. So we sort of isolate. We've got certain things that we want to measure. There, it's done in a controlled way. We can build Bayesian models, that sort of explain the data that's coming out. It's a whole successful industry around that. And what happened, I think it's a real tragedy that Varela died so young, because I think it would have been great to have him around longer, because I think that there wasn't enough time for the empirical side of that view to develop more fully. And I think this is really why, so I think there may be people that are sympathetic to these ideas, and I meet them every now. But if you've got a career that you're trying to develop in, say, cognitive science, it's quite difficult to make a choice for this. Even though the ideas are very, very inspiring, they're very intriguing, but I think you're in a way you're somehow trapped by the norms of a particular scientific community and about how they go at things and how they feel they should view things. So, and I think this is a group like this. I think one of the things we can do is to try and reinvigorate Varela's program. And I think my hope is that with quantum cognition that we have, I think, some interesting theory and also some interesting empirical methods that can be potentially enhance Varela's ideas around neurophenomenology. That would be, if we can make progress there, I can happily retire and say that this is, I'm done. Because this would be a very, very amazing thing to do, because I think his program stalled. And I think we need to reinvigorate it. So sorry to speak like a religious person, but this is my view.
Do you have a particular kind of a program he wanted to do? I mean, Varela wanted to do that is highly related to some aspect of the quantum cognition program?
Well, I think like he in one of his articles, he talked about multi-stable percepts. Because I think this is one, and now we're talking about that in that grant proposal. But I think more generally, this whole idea, so one of the, in our group here, we talk a lot about, the phenomenological mind, right? And this is really about the experiencing mind. And what do we know about experience? It doesn't exist in advance, right? It suddenly happens. So one of the speculative hypotheses is that the signature of experience would be its contextuality. So it's like experience is like a black hole. You can't really get at it. But just like a black hole has an event horizon, which is the signature of the black hole in order to say it's there, I think using empirical methods to show contextuality would allow us reason to believe that the actual phenomena was enactive, like experiential in nature, rather than being representational or like conventionally realist in nature. This is an example, but in order to achieve this, it's very, very difficult. But we have the theories, like Stephen Phillips, I think, is listening, and we know category theory has also got some interesting theories in this regard to try and get a hold of contextuality. So I think this is just one connection that we can use in order to help stimulate Varela's program.
Yeah. Wow. Steve, do you want to answer to anything about that, or?
Just to say hi to everyone, and very nice talks, both from Peter and from Shigeru. Very fascinating. I agree with Peter, obviously, that category theory has a lot to say. I was also intrigued by Emmanuel's, Emmanuel as well. A question about needing theory to predict when, I think if I understood the question correctly, when and quantum-like phenomena occur and when they don't. If that's correct, then I guess to my mind, something like a resource theory is needed. And I think the quantum-like things that pop up maybe a result of a limited resource where both a shared resource between both the probe and the thing that you're probing. I think some people have done this kind of thing even in the quantum category theory side, but it seems would seem to be one way of looking at it. But yeah, all very interesting.
Yeah, in fact, knowing that your work and also some of the, I think it's Emmanuel's work with Jennifer Trueblood, that the transition from quantum classical probability to quantum probability, and it seems to have a parallel with a pre-sheaf like structure of the cognition to sheaf like cognition. I mean, whether that has a corresponding brain structure or development is still like unclear thing. But yeah, there seems to be some kind of parallel between them.
Yes, I get. Well, even on a non-technical level, a question for Emmanuel then would be: has anyone done anything in terms of available resources? I mean, it's common, of course, to do that in cognitive psychology. Like with working memory capacity limit type experiments, but in the context of quantum-like cognition, has anyone even pursued that idea?
Well, the only ideas are that, so actually in a project I was involved as well, but primarily Jennifer and James Heasley had the original idea. They basically explore the hierarchy of representations. So if you imagine a two-dimensional quantum space, you can represent like two binary questions on the same space, right? But then you can keep going up, right? So you can have like actually say three questions. You can have a hybrid space where some of your eigenstates are basically joint eigenstates for two of your questions, but not the third. And then you can have a fully Bayesian space where each eigenstate basically corresponds to a combination of outcomes for all three questions. So anyway, there's basically, they had like they tried to fit models where you could go from full Bayesian to half Bayesian, half quantum to fully quantum-like for a couple of questions, and they found that more quantum-like representations were more likely. So the task had like a lot of blocks. So early in the task, there was some evidence that early in the task there were more quantum-like representations. So it kind of perhaps looks like perhaps familiarity can sort of create a transition from more quantum-like representations to more Bayesian representations. Now that makes sense because with Bayesian representations, as you know, you need to construct a joint probability distribution, which is a very complex object, right? Mm-hmm. If you have like either three binary questions, you have like 8 terms. So ostensibly for the mind, that's a kind of a difficult thing. And also it looked as if, you may have heard of the Kahneman system 1, system 2, so there's a psychometrics test, a cognitive reflection test and variant that ostensibly measures more reflective versus more reflexive cognition. So again, it looked as if for participants who are more reflexive, that is more intuitive and more spontaneous, you'd be a bit more likely to have quantum-like representations. But if I'm honest with you, I think the story is more appealing than the data. I think the data is still quite messy and there's not much evidence. But on the whole, I suppose, at the massively preliminary level, it looks as if familiarity and spontaneity, lack of familiarity and spontaneity might kind of like make the mind use more quantum-like representations. Now, that kind of like line of thinking is somewhat hard to reconcile with a more general view of like, I suppose, having ontological uncertainty across the cognitive system. I think as a program, some work needs to be done in terms of like our understanding of boundaries. That is, when do we expect these more quantum-like representations? When we don't, what are the sort of like factors which lead to a transition from one to the other? And because human representation is not static, right? It changes all the time. I mean, all psychophysicists know that, right? Categorical perception and all this stuff, right? But also, I suppose, it's the origins question again. I mean, like, if we take the view that, say, Bayesian representations are more onerous because you need to construct these big joint probability distributions, then perhaps the reason why we have quantum-like representations is because they're simpler. So, but again, all these are like new. I mean, if you think about the quantum cognition research program, it's about what, 15 years old, right? And I think the first 15 years were all about just trying to make the initial case and trying to get people to understand the basic concepts. So I think now the next level is to try to understand a little bit this question of boundaries and this question of origins.
Yeah, I think the same kind of thing can be also said to probably Shigeru's kind of idea. I think saying everything is interrelated is a bit too coarse, but maybe as a starting point it may be good compared to the contents kind of model of the container model of consciousness. But yeah, like this comment also says boundary between conscious and non-conscious, or these type of things, to what extent, what is relate, to what level of consciousness depends on other people or world and things like that needs to be articulated and also probably empirically testably restated. I think like there is a clearer sort of the dependency, stronger dependency on brain than the mere body on our conscious experience, I think. So it's also a matter of the degree to some extent.
Yeah, I think maybe I'll go off on a tangent, because one of the things that I think is kind of a shame is that the things that Shigeru talks about, right? It doesn't really enter into like the cognitive science, and when you look at like Shigeru, correct me if I'm wrong, like when Varela was talking about an action. The word enact means it bringing forth the world. It's not that the individual is sort of has some sort of interaction with, but their interaction is bringing forth the world, right? And this is a very foreign, like I think it's philosophically very, very interesting, but it's very, very hard for mainstream cognitive science to do anything, because they think the world is just out there, right? And then we interact with the world. This is not, Shigeru, correct me, this is not what Varela was saying. This enactment is actually that we're bringing forth, and the world is bringing forth us at the same time mutually. It's a very beautiful idea that resonates with philosophy of Buddhism, and I understand why Varela was talking. But somehow to be able to validly, scientifically investigate such ideas, this is, I think, what Varela was trying to do, and then unfortunately he died too quickly. This, I think, is the pity to me. Maybe Shigeru, you can add something, your thoughts about such a point.
Yeah, I really agree with you. So it was a pity that Varela died so young, and maybe he had more ideas about how to connect his ideas with empirical studies, empirical cognitive science. And I myself would like to connect such ideas like enactivism, enactive approach, and also Buddhist ideas to empirical scientific consciousness studies. But it is really difficult if we if we want to be correct in philosophical sense. We almost cannot say anything about empirical facts. So I am now quite, how should I say, that was a kind of reconciliation or something like that. So I intentionally used such words like the world and the body without definitions, without precise definitions. That was I intentionally do that because in such a way we can maybe find a way to connect science and philosophy, science and Buddhist ideas and so on. So, as I said at the beginning, that was just a trial and error. So, in such a way, maybe we can find a clue to connect science and philosophy. Yes. So.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
Maybe I don't know whether this interpretation is kind of biased or distorting what you guys are saying, but to kind of correct the statement that you have been making, to me it sounds like, so maybe those people who are listening right now are not really familiar with what the Varela said, right? And one part of the Varela's statement probably, which Peter wants to study, is something like the experience as a lived experience, like the complexity of the life as such, like real life itself, but always third person science needs to cut out and abstract out and make it really artificial. So we need to connect this scientific third person type and so lived experience in some way, and which is what Shigeru wants to do, but doing that is always very difficult. It has been, at least. But like what Emmanuel was saying, like part of this difficulty is this one-timeness of the experience, right? Like anytime when you try to do things, usually it's one time, usually it's unfamiliar, and then with a previous classical kind of approach, this one-timeness or unfamiliar thing is so difficult to analyze a model. But maybe the quantum approach is the thing that's necessary to understand this. And
Yeah,
that's
yeah. But I think that this, in some senses, quantum physics had the same, or still has the same problem, because when you talk about electrons and things like they use in experiments, like the one when they fire an electron into a gas chamber, right? And so you see a path on the photographic plate. And normally, if you look at that, you can see it's just like that electron is always existing, and it's hitting a gas molecule, and energy is released, and then it's impinged on the photographic plate, and that makes the path. But quantum physics tells a different story. Like when the electron gun goes off, the electron appears very briefly in space-time, and then it goes into this sort of background of potentialities that evolves, and then this interacts with the gas, and then the electron appears very, very briefly, again, interacts with the gas molecule, the energy is released, and then it's gone. So each time there is a new experience, a new electron, a totally new experience. So it's not a one existing the whole time. So I think this sort of view is necessary when we talk about experience. So I think I'm a human being that's moving through the world, but each time I meet a new encounter, a new experience, there's a new me, in a sense. New experiential me. So, and then a new one again. This is, I think, the view. We need to shift our worldview.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Right.
Yeah, and maybe we can change our image of science, and or we must think about what is science really for. What is the purpose of science? So far, we tried to fix something really in a rigid way by science, but such fixation or rigid identification or something like that is only one type of one type of activity that we are doing in our everyday life, and maybe such an activity of trying to grasp rigidly or precisely, such an activity itself must be contextualized. Such an activity itself must be placed in a context of everyday life and complex experience. Then maybe we can see scientific activity from a different perspective. Maybe we can find a new, more limited, more restricted value of scientific results, and we can connect it to more complex experience and the world. So maybe we can change the meaning of science in such a way. Just an idea.
Shigeru, that sounds very Heideggerian. Doesn't it?
Maybe, but I'd like to say I'm very inactive and Valerian.
Okay. Thank you very much. So we passed roughly like probably almost approaching to 90 minutes or even more probably. Yeah. So is there any comment or question from audience?
Maybe just a question to Shigeru about his mediation model. Is there any formalization of the model, or is it still more at the philosophical level?
Sorry, I didn't understand. So is it very formal, or
is there a formal version of the model, or some formal sort of mathematical approach being taken for your model, or is it still more conceptual?
I'm not very good at mathematics, so I cannot precisely develop a mathematical interpretation of this model. But I'm collaborating with a mathematician, Hayato Saigo, and he is a specialist of mathematical physics and quantum category theory, and with him I am trying to find a formulation of such model in terms of category theory. I don't know if it works, but maybe we can find a more mathematical version of mediation model. So it is a little bit similar to Nao's project. So he now is also trying to use category theory to define conscious event, conscious phenomenon, which is always contextualized, which is always placed in a context. And if we want to define something, we must define it by the relationship between this thing and all other things that surrounding this object, or something like that. So that this idea is quite similar to Hayato and what Hayato and I am trying or attempting.
Great.
Thanks for your question.
The model was quite interesting. I thought it was quite analogous to some concepts and categories.
Thanks very much.
Should be
it sounds
Thank you
pretty
very much.
abstract, but at the same time, it may be possible to empirically study, I feel, because if you see this, so you talked about the world and also a body included and also included in each other, right? This kind of structure, as I was reading other things, maybe Hegel is also something like saying something like that, right? The general is included in the specific, and the specific is also included in the general. And this is a sort of the, I think, relationship between the experience itself and the conceptualization or abstraction. So if this, qualia or experience to concept kind of a relation is modeled, I think probably like in category theory, it can be probably like an adjunction, right? Like, from the specific experience, we can extract something abstract as an aspect. And the abstract aspect is applicable to many specific. And this, inclusion and double inclusion is a potentially like a twisted ring that you are talking about.
Yeah. I agree. Yeah, that's very fantastic. If we, we can formalize such structure.
Right. The question is whether we can do any kind of experiment to do that, and whether quantum model is something that is potentially at work in this thing. But I think, experience to abstraction, pure experience to conceptualization is related probably to the relationship between the consciousness and attention, which is already like neuroscientifically tractable. So we can probably make some progress in that sense. That also addresses some of the question from Iota, like how to make this kind of idea into testable, I think. All right. Is there any comment or questions? Otherwise, it was fantastic. It's been very stimulating, and there are lots of ideas that never emerged before this, and changed a lots of ideas, mind, attitude. So I think this was great. Thank you very much for you all, especially Peter and Shigeru, and people who commented, Emmanuel and so Steve, and people who questioned. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'll